It's day 21 of the Advent calendar, my friends. Yesterday we talked about arms and armors. Today we'll talk about initial researches, listening, and finishing.
The time has come to reclaim our world. Welcome back, Commander.
Incoming transmission.
Day 21, strategy, initial researches. So your first three researches that are going to be available to you to pick from are modular weapons, hybrid materials, and alien biotech. Your choice here is going to be largely on what you prefer or what you need, or if we figure out that one is better than the other. And that's what I want to talk about. So, looking at them, some of them offer more immediate gains than others. Modular weapons offers you the ability to use looted weapon mods. You cannot equip them without having researched modular weapons. And if you acquired some of those on your first mission before you get to choose your first research, then I think that might be worth going into, unless it was a weapon mod that doesn't really significantly benefit you, like a 5% hair trigger, a chance of getting an extra turn, 5%. That's not like a big deal. Hybrid materials gives you access to the nanoscale vest, which you have to produce yourself at some material cost, probably alien alloys if I had to guess, which you might not have until after you've cleared some rooms. So if your room clearing isn't going to match up with the end of this technology or beat it, then that may not benefit you as immediately as modular weapons might. And alien biotech is going to give you the ability to build the Advanced Warfare Center facility within the Avenger, which is really cool. It does seem to offer you the ability to gain random perks when a soldier levels up. This is, of course, it's random whether you get one, and it's random which one you get. But every perk is a lot of power. Think about each soldier is going to have, what, one initial perk and 6 choices? 7? Can't remember. Anyway, so an extra perk is 1/6 of the amount of, special abilities they're going to get. So gaining an extra perk, if they can gain multiple extra perks, that would be crazy good, is a big, big deal. Especially when it lets you cross-class. Plus, apparently there are perks, I heard Beagle Rush say this, from the Advanced Warfare Center that you cannot get anywhere else, that do not come from other soldier tech trees. So everyone's going to want as many free perks as possible. So getting that Advanced Warfare Center up as soon as possible is a good idea. Basically, I would suggest going for modular weapons or hybrid materials. Since the Advanced Warfare Center requires you to clear an area, I would start researching modular weapons to use those weapon mods, probably even if I didn't have any weapon mods. And then I would start clearing a room with an engineer, which would help me pay for those nanoscale vests once I finished hybrid materials second. And then I would move into alien biotech to get that Advanced Warfare Center, which I will be able to place in the newly cleared room. Of course, each technology unlocks further technologies, or most technologies do. And I'm going to go over the ones we've seen so far. Modular weapons grants you the ability to research magnetic weapons. Now, initially, with just the one scientist, Dr. Tigan, it takes 55 days on legendary difficulty to research magnetic weapons, whereas other researches take significantly less, like 3 to 7 days for autopsies. I think the autopsies are and even the armor stuff is maybe like 28 days, which is long. 55 is too long. You have to have more scientists before you approach technology with that time scale, or you're going to fall behind in power level. Matter of fact, you're going to find out that when you actually finally get that bonus, those like next tier weapons, you're barely going to be keeping up. So research the fast things first, I suggest. But yeah, so modular weapons. Use weapon mods, unlocks magnetic weapons. Hybrid materials unlocks the nanoscale vest for production and allows you to research plated armor. Plated armor doesn't take as long to research as modular weapons, I think. Or it might be that when the playthrough I was watching, they had already acquired another scientist by the time they dug into it. Which actually, yes, I believe that is the case. I believe magnetic weapons and plated armor take the same amount of time. Between the two of those, I would be torn. I think the armor might actually be better. This is a little flip from XCOM 2012. Because the armor specials and the different armor types, that is the spider suit, the exosuit, the predator armor, I believe all come from this research, though I'm not completely sure, are amazing. And not only are they amazing, but they give you additional health, which makes it less likely you'll lose an experienced soldier. And then the enemies, your initial weapons are fairly effective against the initial enemies we've seen. And with good tactics and plenty of special abilities, I don't think you need the extra damage as much as you need the extra health, because that helps you fight the RNG. The RNG will let a hit get through, right? It will throw some critical success for the aliens. And while having good weapons will let you kill them sooner, they're going to hit you sometime, eventually. It doesn't matter how much time you give them. Eventually there'll be an alien sitting there, they'll take a shot and it'll hit, even if you've done your best to kill them as quickly as possible, which the better weapons would help you do. But eventually you're going to get hit, and that's when you need the plated armor. And then the armors come with these awesome abilities and the heavy weapon slots, and yeah, I think it's totally worth it to go plated armor before mag weapons. But suit your preference on easier difficulties. It's probably totally up to you. But you'll want to sign another scientist or two before you even try to go after these long-term technologies, these long research times. So that brings us to alien biotech, which is what I would suggest as your the third priority out of the initial three, the lowest priority. So alien biotech lets you build a new facility, the Advanced Warfare Center inside the Avenger. It also unlocks your ability to autopsy sectoids and to autopsy officers. These two are, the officer is going to advance the plot, and the sectoid is going to open up psionics for research. Now, psionics, obviously tempting, unlocks the 5th class, the psi operative somehow. Sectoid autopsy itself actually, not only does it give you access to the psi lab, or to psionics research, not the psi lab, but it gives you access to an item called the Mind Shield. We don't know what this does currently. I haven't seen it anywhere. Presumably it raises your willpower, which makes you more resistant to panic and psi attacks and other things. But maybe it does something else too. I suggest the officer autopsy, personally. The sectoid autopsy is nice, but then all you get is the Mind Shield, and then you're going into... then you have to spend a lot of time researching psionics. And researching psionics is probably a long-term thing, and what that's going to give you access to, for sure, is the psi lab. But then you have to build the psi lab somewhere. You have to have power for the psi lab. The psi lab, I've heard from Garth DeAngelis's commentary on one of the streams he was on, is pretty expensive. And then the psi operative itself is a big time sink when it comes to a soldier. So that's not really early game stuff. I would save it for once you got your feet on the ground with everything else, probably magnetic weapons and plated armor, then look into investing in the psi lab, unless you're just going, you're off the chain when it comes to resources. So if you favor the Advent Officer Autopsy, this is going to get you a good bit of stuff. It'll give you access. It'll upgrade your primary objectives, which will go to access the alien network. This has 3 sub-objectives. One is build the proving ground within the Avenger. The next one is construct a Skulljack item that you can equip. I believe this raises your hack. We covered this in the last episode. It does appear to let you melee stun an Advent and access their brain for information somehow, and then kills them once you're done. And then it wants you to Skulljack an officer. So, of course, the Advent Officer Autopsy also unlocks the Proving Ground facility itself for construction, and the Trooper Autopsy, which seems a little backwards, but whatever. The Proving Ground is a really cool facility, and it's worth getting early, I think. It lets you turn Elerium cores into new types of weapons and armor things, like the incendiary grenades that cause burning, and the acid grenades, and all sorts of things like this. So I think the Proving Ground is a really cool place to get a nice tactical boost for those in exchange for Elerium cores. Trooper Autopsy then gives you battle scanners, which is a nice item and really worth looking into, although you may have trouble carrying it unless you have additional pockets from the Predator armor, most likely. So another string of researches that will pop up really early, but is not one of the initial 3 available to you, is resistance communications. And this is something that you're going to want to look into before the first black site warning pops up and you're told that a black site is available for attack. Resistance communications is the beginning of spreading the territory that you control as XCOM across the world, and you just need to start early so that you can begin building up your income, because that's what that's going to let you do. It opens up your ability to build resistance comms, which are a facility within the Avenger that increase your contact resource. It also unlocks the resistance contacts resource itself. So it gives you a facility to boost this resource and the resource for the first time. An initial amount of 3 contacts, I believe. And it unlocks the further research resistance radio. So resistance contacts, this is the maximum number of territories that you can actually have in the XCOM network. And resistance comms is the facility that increases that number, which of course can be manned by an engineer to further increase that number without building a completely new facility. I expect you'll probably have to build 2 resistance comms facilities to cover most of the world, maybe 3 total. But 1 is going to be enough for the early game, I suspect, unless you're rushing to take over a continent or the black sites are really pushing you to expand in awkward directions. You're going to need this so you can get to resistance radio fairly early. And it might be worth putting off one of weapons or armor, or even both if you don't have a scientist to make the research quick. Resistance radio, which is unlocked by resistance communications, is going to allow you to build radio relays on the strategic map. What these do is they make expanding cheaper, because expansion costs intel, and it costs, like, I think I saw in the legendary playthrough that Christopher Odd was playing, that it was 60 intel per link distance. And link distance is how far from your headquarters or from the nearest radio relay that territory is. So radio relays can significantly cut down on the intel expenditure it takes to expand across the map. And when it comes to black sites being announced, they're going to be in enemy territory, and you're going to have to contact that territory before you can find out where that black site is and attack it. So if you wait until the black site is announced, then it's going to be up and running for for all the time it takes you to research resistance communications and resistance radio, and then maybe build a radio relay if it's far from your headquarters, and then you're going to have to spend intel to contact that region, and then you can finally attack the black site. And you're going to want to have a jump on that, lest the black site provide the Avatar project a couple blips that will eventually lead to your doom. So I suggest knocking those out as soon as possible, as soon as your tactical game will allow. If you're under really heavy pressure in the tactical game, maybe go for the better armor, I would suggest, or the better weapons. But you want to get to resistance radio pretty fast. Even if it seems like you're like, oh, I'm not going to expand anytime soon, I don't need these radio relays. Maybe you do, because intel doesn't seem to come in massive amounts. But if you do have a lot of intel, you might be able to skip radio, but you still need communications pretty desperately, because that is your big economic research early game. So then the last ones I wanted to cover, there's a couple that'll pop up as you play as well that aren't tied into these mainstream ones. There is the Faceless Autopsy. Finishing this gives you access to the Mimic Beacon, which is an item that can draw fire instead of your squad. This is a really interesting oh shit button kind of item, and you would want to play around with it, because there's a chance it can be incredibly powerful or the chance it could be really weak. It really depends on how it works, how the aliens react to it, like do they always target it, and how quickly it goes down. I would be very curious to know, but it might be incredibly good. I would suspect once you get some moderately skilled psi operatives out, their utility is going to kind of like replace your need for the Mimic Beacon. But if you want to be extra cautious, I would consider taking a Mimic Beacon regularly. The Viper Autopsy, you'll be killing Vipers early game sometime soon, and you'll collect enough corpses for an autopsy. Maybe it only takes one for each autopsy. That would be reasonable. I don't know exactly what that'll unlock, but it's possible to be there. Maybe if you don't have medikits, the Viper Autopsy might unlock medikits. And if you do start off with the ability to bring medikits, the Viper Autopsy may let you improve it, or that was something that happened in XCOM 2012. I don't think the Proving Grounds is what allows you access to Venom rounds, so I don't think it's that. But it might be like the Hazmat suit, if plated armor itself doesn't unlock that. So then lastly, the magnetic weapons tech, it of course unlocks better weapons. Generally the damage upgrade is 1 point, give or take the randomization. You can probably expect advanced versions of all of the class's secondary items, like the Gremlin, the pistol, the grenade launcher, and the... what am I forgetting? Gremlin, pistol, grenade launcher. Seriously? Sword. Of course, the sword. Anyway, so you can expect upgrades to all of that. Those are all really good. Better weapons are all really good. And expect to expend some amount of resources making those upgrades happen and building the equipment and a little bit of time afterwards. So, you know, it's good, but you better have some alloys on hand to construct what it's making. Plated armor, the same way. You're going to want to have a stash of alloys ready to create the exosuits and the spider suits. I believe these you have to create. The Predator armor, maybe you just build one suit and then everyone can equip it, but I'm pretty sure you have to build one each of every spider suit and exosuit, from what I've heard. Also, maybe plated armor will unlock the hazmat vest or something, which adds health and resistance to the various environmental effects that can be scattered around, like poison and acid and fire. And then, of course, the psionics research is going to unlock the Psi Lab, I'm pretty sure. and a whole new class as, oh yes, and it unlocks the advanced Psi amp, which is the special item for the Psi operative, similar to the pistol, gremlin, sword, and grenade launcher. So those are all the initial researches. I do suggest you go modular weapons, hybrid materials, alien biotech, and you squeeze in resistance communications as soon as possible. And then dip into resistance radio around the time the first black site is being announced so that you can actually make solid progress towards it and crush it before it adds too many ticks to the
Incoming transmission.
Day 21, Tactics Listening. So when I say listening, this is purposefully vague. I mean to your briefing, that is before you commit your troops, there are a couple little pieces of information you get. In Long War, and hopefully in the Long War Studios XCOM 2 mod, you eventually, they added in the mechanic where you got a hint about the terrain type you would be launching into. And I think that would be, hopefully, it wouldn't be too hard in XCOM 2 because they have pleasant names like Shantytown or City Center or whatever for the randomly generated map type, you know, the map set. And it was actually really, really useful because the different terrain had different, you know, subtly different characteristics. Like forests had large sight lines because while there were lots of trees, there was plenty of heavy cover to go around. And that heavy cover was relatively hard to destroy because trees had to be destroyed twice, whereas most cover had to be destroyed once. But they would blow up and turn to a charred stump, and then the charred stump also had to be destroyed, which is really useful for surviving against enemies that could destroy cover easily. And were great for snipers. Like, it was better to bring a sniper because squad sight was more useful because of the, like, more available sight lines. Whereas in cities, maybe a scout was better or low cover was better because when you're up on a roof, you often had access to low cover at the edges, which was nice, but heavy cover was more desirable. And so soldiers that could treat that low cover as high cover were better. And then, you know, there are a couple of maps that everyone hated. Like when you saw Waterfront, you're like, oh, there's only 2 Waterfront maps and one of them is super brutal because it's got this huge building and there's nothing that blocks your line of sight at all. And so you end up getting swarmed very often because it's really not big and their huge open arena kind of combat would always turn up and it was brutal. So, you don't get that in vanilla XCOM 2, but you do get mission type and mission difficulty. Now, I don't know all the mission types. We have seen supply raids where there are specific things you need to not damage as you raid like an advent train, it seemed to be. And so the train, you know there's going to be good cover for the enemies. They're probably going to be near the train. But otherwise they may be in whatever, like the train's always going to be there because it's what carries the supplies. And you can't use explosives too close to the train. So maybe not grenadiers, maybe yes, sharpshooters or more precise weaponry. And there's going to be heavy cover from the doors on the train. And so you're going to need people who can shoot through heavy cover. And it's hard to destroy the train doors because they're made of such, resilient materials. And there's retaliation strikes, which happen in like shanty towns, which are your main supporter because you're a rebel group or like, people outside the city center. And they're looking at that terrain. There appears to be like a couple buildings, but there are nice rid lines. There's like open markety things. So a lot of sight lines and a couple buildings. And then there's the city centers with lots of buildings. And heavy cover in like concentrated areas, and then these kind of more open spaces where there's only benches and hollow projectors. So try and develop a sense of what's different about each mission type so that you know something when you're going in, so you can prepare a little bit better. You're like, whenever I go to a black site, there's always a building that I wish I knew what was inside before I get there. Or whenever I'm in the city center, like, I'll be on one side of a building and I can go to the other side, but it would be, and you're like, oh, I should bring a battle scanner. If I bring a battle scanner, just that one time I'll be able to like take a peek like inside the building before I breach it. Or I'll be able to throw this over those buildings in the city center and see what's in the courtyard on the other side before I commit, and maybe trigger an alien pod. Or if you're like, oh, most of the environments in the city center are actually hard to destroy, maybe I should bring X kind of grenade that's better at destroying that, if there is such a grenade. Or you're like, maybe I should focus on bringing rockets instead of flamethrowers in my heavy weapon slots so that they will nuke those walls because they do enough damage. Consider carefully, like, maybe two snipers isn't the best choice on this map because there's so many places for enemies to hide, or there's usually not that much high terrain. From what I've seen, there's a lot of terrain level built into the generator, like it guarantees quite a bit of like vertical variability into each map. But on a lot of the maps that seem to be out in like the suburbs, it didn't seem like there was that much high ground. We saw people assaulting like churches a lot in the preview content. Assaulting churches. Well, I mean, I saw a Beagle Rush attack a church in one of his playthroughs. I think it was the second mission between the black site and the intro mission, where there was like scanners out there, and he ended up fighting a couple advent pods that spawned basically near the church, or activated near the church. And in that one, you're like, well, there's no high ground. It seems like a waste to have my sniper with the death from above perk come on this mission. Like, if you can guess at those kind of circumstances, it can really help you out. Difficulty, on the other hand, is a tough one to parse. In XCOM 2012, difficulty actually indicated number of aliens you would encounter, not how tough they actually were. You could go on a easy, double quote, mission and find out that it was full of ethereals or something really awful. Your first sectopod, matter of fact, easy missions later in the game were the ones that would really trash you, because it meant that you were getting a break on the number of enemies because they're introducing a brand new terrible enemy like the sectopod. So we're gonna have to wait and see what difficulty means. You couldn't trust them in the last game. I think they might have learned their lesson, but let's just go ahead and say you can't trust them this game either, and see if you can figure out what it means. Because once you realized it meant number of enemies, you could use that to your advantage. You're like, easy. If I have fewer enemies, then I don't need to pack as many grenades, right? Then I only have to destroy their cover a couple times and then lay waste to them, Like, the more enemies there are, the more you have to spread out your grenade use, because when you destroy something's cover, it's basically dead. How many times do you have to destroy cover in a game? Well, the more enemies you have to kill, the more times you have to destroy cover. And so then you want more grenades. Or you can bring other stuff if there's less enemies. So if that's how it turns out, keep that in mind. Also, like mind control, you can only use it on one enemy per level. If you can get a gauge on how many enemies there are going to be, then that's pretty powerful. You can be like, I'm going to save my mind control until I'm halfway through the level. So then I'll have it against, the last couple pods after my troops are kind of worn out. Or you'll be like, I'm going to grab this soldier right away because this Advent Shield Bearer is going to last me the whole mission because there's just not that many enemies. And so getting him earlier is better. When you're on a tactical mission, listening is also really important. Every enemy is going to make sounds when they move in the fog of war that reveal what race it is. You need to be careful for basically two types of sounds. The one sound is the sound you do know what it is, and the other one is the sound where you don't know what it is. When you do know what it is, that tells you something about what's going on. You'll be like, ah, there's a Viper out there somewhere, or ooh, that sounds like a mech. Or you'll be like, oh, I don't know what the hell that was. I should be careful. And when you hear something and it sounds mechanically, you should think, I should preserve my ability to shred armor. And when you hear something that sounds organic-ish, you should think, my psi abilities will be pretty useful. Maybe I should, And you're like, where's my hacker again? Maybe I should keep him, safe but close enough to act. And, of course, if you go long enough without contact in XCOM 2012, it was the second round you went without contact and ended your turn. So you end your turn twice, and you haven't seen an enemy during either of those turns. Then during the alien turn, you would actually hear the nearest pod. And the trick was it was always the closest pod, but that's before the aliens move, or that's the alien pods. I'm not sure if they move, if they double moved, or if they made I think they just make a single move. But you might hear a pod and be like, those were thin men. But then it turns out that they had moved, and another pod had moved, and there was actually a pod of mutons that were closer to you now that you then triggered going after that thin man sound. And so, well, it's great to know in the general direction in which the closest pod was. And of course, in XCOM 2, you take into account the fact that they kind of walk instead of sprinting like the XCOM 2012 pods did. XCOM 2012 pods would cover some frickin' ground. They could go all the way across the frickin' map on their turn, some of them, which was terrifying and obnoxious in some cases. And it made them really hard to predict, which was kind of not fun because you tried really hard to use your battle scanners and your knowledge of the terrain to your advantage. And then this group of floaters would just book it across the whole map and trigger, and you're like, ah. But in XCOM 2012, they don't move so far. So really important cue, and something to abuse to your advantage, is you get those yellow ripples that indicate there's an enemy over in that direction. Really, really useful, because then you could be like, wait, so there's a building in that direction, and you're like, did I see into that building? You're like, yeah, one of my characters actually looked through those windows. It probably would have triggered them if they were in it. They're probably on the other side of the building. And then you're like, ooh, we can set up an ambush. And it helps you figure out, where to move. Or you're like, we have a VIP, we're trying to get out of here. Good to know those guys are there. Let's totally avoid them as hard as we can. But basically, just pay attention to everything you can, because all of it will help you set up yourself.
Incoming transmission.
Day 21, disposition, finish them. So when I say finish them, I mean Mortal Kombat. No. So there are, obviously, killing enemies is the right idea in XCOM. You don't get a mercy bonus. You may need to interrogate them using the Skulljack, sure, but that kills them too. But I want you to think about the act of eliminating an enemy from combat in a couple ways. So first off, and most basic and incredibly useful, is if you eliminate an enemy, they do not get an action. So you reduce the number of enemy actions on the enemy turn, which generally makes you much, much safer. Now, not all actions are created equal, and this is why it can be really tempting to, even though there's a pile of minions with them, focus down the officer or the greatest threat, because their actions are going to empower all these Advent troopers that otherwise are relatively ineffective. So you want to identify every round which enemies it would be most effective to deny their actions. And barring that, there's, can I leave it alive because its actions are ineffective? Stasis is the perfect example. I don't need to kill it, I can stasis it this turn and it won't be able to move at all or do anything. It is the most ineffective possible enemy on the field. Therefore, killing it is worthless. when when picking your targets, you're always going to have to choose. Rarely, I mean, you might be able to wipe out a whole pod all at once. Early game, maybe even mid game. If you get really lucky, late game, it's possible. But into the late game, enemies start being tough enough that you cannot just eliminate a whole pod. You do have to like stand up, fight it, or at least withdraw ambush over and over again. But you can expect enemies to you can expect to not pod wipe the aliens all the time. So then the question becomes, which ones do you leave alive? How do you make ineffective the other ones? Like, how do you work with what you have? And you want to leave, if there's an enemy who will be ineffective, don't kill them. Focus on someone else. With the officers and the troopers, I mean, the officers aren't that much deadlier than the troopers, but you really want the officers dead because they can make all the troopers better with their marked target ability, which is pretty brutal. Plus they can mark and then shoot, which makes both of their actions effective actions, whereas troopers can only move and shoot, which gives them basically one effective action. So taking out an officer is actually a much bigger deal than taking out a trooper. So you're going to want to kill the officer and then maim or disable as many of the troopers as you can to like safeguard your squad against destruction. That is the basics of killing enemies in tactical combat. Now, an interesting new mechanic in XCOM 2 is that when you break an enemy pod and there's like a survivor, they will sometimes run out into the shadows, into the fog of war, and find another alien pod to join. Now, I've never seen this, but I've heard multiple people say that it happens, and I think this is super cool. It's got pros and cons for you. One is you can let them go and take care of yourself. If you're really beat up or you need some time to reorganize or reload, pursuing might not be the best idea. Go ahead and take the time that you just were bought and let that enemy go. Generally, I feel like the enemies that get away aren't going to be the high priority targets for the most part, because the really nasty things are never going to break for one reason or another. And they're likely to be the ones you're going to kill early, so often it's minions that are left over. But hey, look. Or you can pursue to try and finish them off, because that's basically weakening or preventing like more aliens from popping up in the next pod. The good news about letting them go is that you can then ambush that pod again. And this one soldier, whoever gets away, is going to have to go through 2 different ambushes from you if they're really unlucky. And of course, when you ambush a pod with all that Overwatch and stuff, like, it's a serious benefit to you, and it probably outweighs the addition of one more member to their pod. On the other hand, their pod has an extra member, which it didn't before, which makes encountering that pod more dangerous than before. And that member may soak your Overwatch fire, and you have a trooper getting hit instead of the sectoid or the berserker, because there are 3 troopers instead of 1 or 2. So all in all, watch out for this behavior. I would be really hesitant to chase, but it might be worthwhile to note the direction they run in, because that may actually be an indicator of where other alien pods on the map are. I'd be really curious to find out if that were the case. But sometimes you gotta let them go in the sake of safety and preparedness, because it's generally not worth hunting them down. Now, it may be something like if they're Advent shield bearers and you kill everything else because the shield bearer is too tanky, and, you know, his bonus kind of sucks on his own, and then he breaks and runs, you might be like, ugh, I don't want to encounter him with another pod, especially if that pod has its own shield bearer. I need to hunt him down. In that case, concealment might be your friend if you have a ranger who can pop back into concealment. And the ability to snipe might be a good idea, because with your sharpshooter, you don't have to physically be forward, and you don't have to increase your line of sight at all to utilize that squad sight ability. So when chasing, be careful, maybe use battle scanners or concealed or ghosted people. Alright friends, that's it for day 21. If you enjoyed this content, please go ahead and like this video. If you'd like to see the next Advent Calendar video as soon as it comes out, please subscribe to my channel. Tomorrow we'll be talking about mission types, environments, and human error. Also, coming up, episode 25 is going to begin the special section of the Advent Calendar, the countdown to release. I think it's going to be really awesome, and I have managed not to spoil it for anyone just yet, so you really don't know what's coming. It's good. Later.